The night was quiet over Philadelphia, the kind of stillness that always made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Neon signs hummed above corner bars, rain slicked the sidewalks, and somewhere in the dark, Ralph Natale was remembering how it all began. He wasn't born into power. He wasn't born into luxury. He was born into a world that rewarded the bold and punished the hesitant. And from the start, he'd decided he would never be the one on his knees. Ralph had grown up in the shadows of South Philly, in an era where every kid knew someone who ran numbers. Every family had a cousin who did work for someone important, and respect meant more than money. The streets were alive back then. Every corner had its own hierarchy. Every handshake had weight, and every favor had a price. But Ralph wasn't like the other kids. While they dreamed of fast cars and thick envelopes, he dreamed of control. He watched the men who ran his neighborhood, how they carried themselves, how people stepped aside when they passed. He noticed the unspoken rules, the tone in their voices, the nods, the silences. Power wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the way a man could end an argument with a glance. That was what fascinated him most. The aura of fear disguised as respect. By the time he was a teenager, Ralph Natale was already running errands for local bookmakers. Small things at first, messages, collections, introductions, but even then, people noticed something about him. He had a calm confidence, a way of speaking that made people listen. He wasn't brash like some of the street punks who tried to prove themselves with fists and noise. Ralph understood patience, and patience in that world was gold. It was the 1940s, and South Philly was a maze of narrow streets, corner delis, and quiet deals. Natale's neighborhood was run by older men who had survived Prohibition, and they saw something in him: discipline. They started bringing him closer, letting him sit in on conversations most kids his age would never hear. One night, at a smoky backroom table in a small bar off Snyder Avenue, an older capo leaned forward and told him, "Kid, you got eyes that see more than you say. That'll keep you alive." Ralph never forgot those words. As the years passed, he rose through the ranks quietly. He learned from the best. Men who'd served under Angelo Bruno himself. Men who understood the delicate balance between profit and peace. Ralph studied everything: how the numbers worked, how the unions moved money, how a single phone call could shift the power of an entire neighborhood. He built relationships, not out of fear, but out of respect. People liked him, and that made him dangerous in the most subtle way possible. By the 1960s, Natale was more than just another soldier. He was a man people trusted. That was rare in a world where trust was currency. He had connections in the labor unions, especially in the hotel and construction industries, where money flowed freely and quietly. He was smart, strategic, and, above all, cautious. He didn't draw attention. While others flashed wealth, Ralph kept his circle small and his movements quiet. He had learned one vital truth from the men who came before him: the louder you are, the shorter your reign. But even the smartest men can't stay invisible forever. It was during this time that he crossed paths with men who would later define his life. Men like Angelo Bruno, whose calm leadership shaped how Ralph saw power. And later, younger, hungrier figures like Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, whose thirst for control would set Philadelphia ablaze. Natale moved carefully between these worlds: old-school diplomacy and new-school aggression. He respected Bruno deeply, but he also understood that the world was changing. The old ways of quiet negotiation were being replaced by men who solved problems with chaos. Ralph saw it coming before most did, the shift from business to blood, and he knew that when it happened, only those who could adapt would survive. By the early 1970s, Natale had built something solid. He had influence, he had money, and he had the loyalty of men who saw in him what he once saw in others: a steady hand in a volatile world. He was especially tied to labor racketeering, a field that made him indispensable to both mobsters and politicians. Unions brought power, power brought leverage, and leverage in Philadelphia was everything. Then came the fall. In 1979, when Bruno was murdered, everything Ralph had learned about restraint, respect, and balance was tested. Philadelphia spiraled into chaos. Men who had once nodded respectfully to Bruno's name now fought for control of what he left behind. Scarfo rose through the ranks like a storm, bringing with him a new age of fear. The city that once ran on quiet discipline became a battlefield. Ralph tried to hold his ground, but in a world without Bruno, his kind of leadership had no place. The calm men were swept aside for the ruthless ones. And when Scarfo finally took over, Ralph knew the rules had changed. He played along, but deep down, he despised what the life had become. It wasn't about family or respect anymore. It was about greed and ego. Still, Natale was too seasoned to disappear. He found ways to survive. When Scarfo's paranoia spread, Ralph stayed low, working his legitimate businesses while keeping an ear to the ground. But even the quiet men have limits. Eventually, his name came up in federal investigations. Union corruption, illegal dealings, whispers that reached Washington. He went to prison in the early 1980s. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. But for Ralph Natale, it was only the beginning. In those steel-gray prison halls, surrounded by men who had once sworn loyalty and then vanished when trouble came, Ralph reflected on everything, his rise, his choices, his silence. He was older now, but not broken. And in that place, he made connections that would define the next chapter of his life. One of those connections was a young man named Joey Merlino, sharp, fearless, and unpredictable. Joey was everything Ralph once had been: hungry, ambitious, and utterly fearless. And though they came from different generations, they understood each other instantly. Ralph saw in Joey the spark that could rebuild what had been lost. Joey saw in Ralph the wisdom to guide him. Together they formed an unlikely bond, a mentor and a prodigy, a man of patience and a man of fire. They spoke late into the nights in prison, swapping stories about the streets, about loyalty, about how the old days had turned to chaos. Ralph would talk about Bruno's way, how power didn't have to mean bloodshed. Joey would laugh, saying, "Maybe that worked back then, old man. But now, respect comes from fear." Ralph would smile faintly. "You'll learn, kid. Fear burns out fast. Respect stays." By the time Natale walked out of prison, he wasn't the same man who'd gone in. He was older, quieter, but sharper than ever. The world had changed, but so had he. And as he stepped back into Philadelphia's cold streets, with the city lights flickering like old memories, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Because for the first time in his life, Ralph Natale wasn't walking back into someone else's world. He was about to build his own. The night was heavy with silence when Ralph Natale sat in the back room of an old Philadelphia bar, the kind where the air carried decades of cigarette smoke and whispered deals. The light bulb flickered overhead, and across from him sat his mentor, a man named Marco the Saint Lucchesi, who wasn't a saint by any stretch of imagination. Marco had the kind of face that told stories, deep lines, a crooked nose, eyes that had seen too much. He leaned in, his voice low. "Ralphie, loyalty's the only currency that never loses value. You forget that and you're dead." Those words would shape Ralph Natale's life more than he could have
known. It was the early 1950s, and Ralph was a young man eager to prove himself in a city teeming with opportunity for the bold and ruin for the careless. He'd already learned that respect wasn't given. It was taken. One job, one favor, one silence at a time. Philadelphia's underworld was an intricate web then: Italian crews, Irish factions, and the remnants of old prohibition gangs that refused to fade quietly. Ralph had started small, running errands for Marco, carrying envelopes, fixing problems that didn't require much talking. But he had something different, a calmness that unnerved people. He didn't brag, didn't panic, didn't make enemies unless necessary. People remembered that. One night, Marco sent him to handle a debt collection. "Guy's name is Frankie Marino," Marco said, tapping ash into an overfilled tray. Owes us 5 grand. He's been ducking me for weeks. Go remind him that money has a memory." Ralph nodded, slipped on his coat, and went to find Frankie. When he got there, he found Frankie terrified. The man wasn't hiding out of defiance. He was broke, desperate. He had a wife, 2 kids, and the weight of a world he couldn't afford to carry. Ralph didn't shout or threaten. Instead, he looked at the man and said, "You got 3 weeks. Pay Marco something every Friday, even if it's just a few dollars. It's not about the money. It's about showing you haven't forgotten." Frankie did as told, and Marco surprisingly didn't complain. "You handled it like a businessman," he said, lighting another cigarette. "That's rare. Most guys would have left him in the hospital." Ralph just smiled faintly. He wasn't in this to show off. He wanted control. Quiet control. By the late 1950s, Ralph Natale had become a trusted name in Marco's circle. He was dependable, loyal, and ruthless only when necessary. But he wasn't blind. He saw how fragile loyalty could be. Men who toasted together one night could be plotting each other's downfall by morning. Marco often told him, "You can trust a man's greed more than his words." When Marco died suddenly of a heart attack, it left a power vacuum in the small but influential crew that had controlled a slice of South Philly. The old guard scrambled for position, and Ralph, younger, quieter, but sharper, stayed patient. He knew something the others didn't. Power wasn't grabbed, it was earned through timing. During the chaos, a man named Tony Baines, a flashy loudmouth who wore gold rings on every finger, started making noise about taking over. "Marco's gone," Tony said at a bar one night, "and we need someone with guts, not a bookkeeper like Ralph." The insult floated through the air like a spark in dry grass. Ralph didn't respond immediately, but a week later, Tony's car was found stripped and burning near the river. Nobody got hurt, but everyone understood the message. Ralph never mentioned it, never claimed responsibility. But that night, the conversations changed. Suddenly, people started calling him Mr. Natale. He became a quiet force, moving through the 1960s as the world changed. Civil rights marches, protests, and the beginnings of a new generation that didn't play by the old rules. But in Philadelphia's underworld, the rules hadn't changed. The mob ran unions, bars, construction sites, and politicians. If money moved, so did they. Ralph learned to balance violence with diplomacy. When disputes arose between crews, he'd call meetings instead of bloodshed. "Killing a man doesn't make you powerful," he told a young enforcer once. "It just makes you predictable." That line spread, earning him a reputation as a thinking man's gangster. In those years, he built connections that would define his life. Among them, his relationship with Angelo Bruno, the calm and calculating gentle Don of Philadelphia. Bruno wasn't like other mob bosses. He believed in peace, in making money quietly. Ralph admired that. The two men shared a mutual respect, and it wasn't long before
Ralph became one of Bruno's key allies. But alliances in this world were like glass, clear but fragile. Ralph knew that Bruno's calm way of running things made enemies, especially among younger men who thought peace was weakness. Ralph, always the observer, began to notice the tension growing. Bruno's old ways were clashing with a new breed of gangsters, impatient, ambitious, and hungry for chaos. Ralph, however, kept his focus on business. He started investing in legitimate fronts, restaurants, clubs, and even a few real estate ventures. He believed in preparing for the day when the streets would no longer be safe ground. "Smart men think ahead," he often told his wife, though he rarely spoke of what he truly did. She didn't ask, and he didn't explain. That was the unspoken rule of their marriage. By the 1970s, Ralph Natale had become a quiet legend. He wasn't the biggest name, but everyone knew him. He had a way of walking into a room and commanding respect without raising his voice. But behind that calm exterior, something was changing. The peace that Bruno had maintained was starting to crumble, and Ralph could feel the shift in the air, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. Whispers of betrayal started to spread through the ranks. Men who'd once sat at the same table now avoided each other's eyes. Deals went missing, and so did people. Ralph tried to stay neutral, but in a world built on loyalty and fear, neutrality was dangerous. One evening, Bruno invited him to dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant. The two men sat in a corner booth, sharing wine and small talk before Bruno finally said, Things are changing, Ralph. The young ones, they don't want peace anymore. Ralph looked at him carefully. Then we'll remind them that chaos doesn't pay, he said. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The world Bruno had built, quiet, orderly, respectful, was dying. And when the storm came, Ralph Natale would have to decide where he stood, with the old ways he respected or the new wave that threatened to destroy everything. Outside that night, as he stepped into the cold Philadelphia air, Ralph felt the first tremor of what was coming. The air tasted different, heavier, sharper. Something was about to break, and when it did, it would change the city forever. That night, as he drove home through the dark streets, his mind replayed Marco's words from years ago. Loyalty's the only currency that never loses value. But now, he wondered, in a world where everyone was cashing out, would loyalty still be worth anything at all? The answer would come soon enough, in blood, betrayal, and the kind of lessons that only time and treachery could teach. Ralph Natale didn't know it yet, but the quiet man of reason was about to step into a storm that would make him one of the most unlikely figures in mob history. The man who would rise, fall, and one day, betray the very thing he once lived for. The rain had a way of washing over Philadelphia that winter, as if the sky itself was trying to rinse away the city's sins. Ralph Natale watched it fall through the glass window of his office above a small restaurant he owned near South Broad. It was late, past midnight, and the streets were quiet except for the hum of passing cars. He had the habit of staying late, not out of paranoia, but reflection. The older he got, the more he understood that silence was where truth hid best. The year was 1975, and the streets were changing faster than the old guard could adapt. The young men weren't afraid anymore. They didn't respect hierarchy, and they sure as hell didn't respect peace. They wanted everything: money, power, fear, and they wanted it now. Ralph saw it in their eyes, a hunger that could eat through loyalty in a heartbeat. He had been keeping close to Angelo Bruno, who still believed in diplomacy over bloodshed. Bruno ran things with quiet authority, like a father disappointed in his reckless sons. But his peacekeeping approach made the younger factions restless, particularly the crew led by a brash, ambitious man named Antonio "Tony" Caponegro, who thought the old ways were holding them back. "Bruno's weak," Tony had said one night at a smoky backroom poker game Ralph happened to attend. "He's too soft. The world's changing and he's still thinking like it's 1950. We could own this city, but he's busy worrying about who gets offended." Ralph said nothing. He simply folded his cards, stared at the ashtray, and listened. Because in this life, you learned that silence was your best weapon. Every word you didn't say could one day save your life. Tony's crew wasn't the only one murmuring. Even the lower-level guys were growing impatient. The drugs, the unions, the clubs, everything was being contested. The money was flowing, but so were the grudges. Ralph knew that change was coming, but what he didn't know was how soon it would hit. One evening, Bruno called him in. "Sit, Ralph," the Don said, pouring 2 glasses of red wine. The man's voice was calm, yet heavy. "You see what's happening out there. I can't stop the tide, but maybe you can help slow it." Ralph leaned back. "You mean talk to them?" "I mean remind them who we are," Bruno said softly. "They think they're building an empire, but they're breaking one instead. You have a way with people. You speak and they listen. Make them remember there's more to this than greed." Ralph didn't argue. He respected Bruno deeply, maybe more than anyone else he'd ever worked with. Bruno represented everything Ralph believed in: order, intelligence, control. But deep down, Ralph knew the truth. No speech could fix what was already cracking. The next few months were a blur of tense meetings, whispered threats, and uneasy truces. Ralph moved between crews like a diplomat walking through a minefield. Sometimes he'd calm them down with promises of future deals, sometimes with quiet warnings. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, men listened. But then came the call. It was late, one March night in 1980. Ralph was home, sitting in his den when his phone rang. "You hear what happened?" the voice said. "They got Bruno, shot him in his car." The words hit like a hammer. Ralph didn't speak for a long time. The man who had kept the peace for decades, who believed in respect and restraint, had been gunned down outside his own home. Just like that, Philadelphia's balance shattered. For Ralph Natale, that night was the turning point. He drove through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting in puddles, and for the first time in years he felt something unfamiliar. Rage. Not the kind that makes you reckless, but the cold kind. The kind that sits deep in your chest and whispers, "This is what happens when respect dies." Bruno's death set off a storm. The new generation, wild, violent, unpredictable, stepped in to fill the void. The commission in New York wasn't happy. They didn't approve the hit, and the Philly mob quickly turned into a battlefield. Ralph tried to stay on the edges, but his name carried too much weight to stay uninvolved. He became a stabilizer again, the man people called when things went wrong. And things went wrong a lot. One afternoon, during a tense sit-down at a small cafe, two rival captains nearly came to blows over territory disputes. Ralph, calm as ever, lifted his coffee and said, "You know what's funny about greed? It makes a man think short-term. But short-term thinkers never die old." The room fell silent. The two men exchanged looks, and for the moment, peace held. But the violence outside didn't stop. It bled through every block, every alley. Ralph saw bodies drop, alliances crumble, and men he'd once mentored turn on each other for scraps. He started to see the writing on the wall. The old world was gone, and the rules that once protected them no longer applied. Still, he didn't give up on control. He made new connections. Union, officials, politicians, businessmen, anyone who understood that power was shifting. He began to weave his influence beyond the streets into the legitimate world. Construction deals, property investments, even nightlife ventures. Everything had a layer of respectability, even if everyone knew what lay beneath. One night, while sitting in the back room of a restaurant with his trusted friend Joey Merlino, a fiery, younger man who admired Ralph, he said, "Joey, remember something. Power's not about who scares the most people. It's about who gets to walk away untouched when the dust settles." Joey nodded, but Ralph could see the spark in his eyes. That same hunger he'd once had as a young man. The problem was, Joey wasn't like Ralph. He didn't have patience. He wanted his kingdom fast. Over the next few years, Ralph began to see in Joey what Marco once saw in him: ambition, intelligence, and danger. He took Joey under his wing, showing him how to build connections, how to make people follow without shouting. "You lead with respect first," Ralph said one evening. "Fear comes second. You use it only when you have to." But as Joey's reputation grew, so did his ego. He loved the spotlight, the fame, the attention. He'd show up at clubs, laugh loudly, shake hands with reporters. Ralph, ever the traditionalist, warned him, "Keep your face out of the papers, Joey. Men who crave fame don't last long." Joey just smiled. "Times are different, Ralph. Respect's overrated. People only remember who they see." That line haunted Ralph for weeks. It was the opposite of everything he believed. To him, real power thrived in silence, in shadows. But the younger generation didn't care. They wanted to be seen, known, feared, and that, he knew, would lead to disaster. By 1990, Ralph Natale had weathered storms that would have sunk most men. He had outlived bosses, betrayals, and shifts in power. He'd gone from a quiet street enforcer to one of the last symbols of old-school order. But the world outside was no longer his. The FBI was watching everyone. Wires, informants, surveillance. The game had changed completely. Every move was recorded, every conversation, a risk. Ralph felt it tightening around him like a noose. Still, he refused to panic. "There's always a way to adapt," he told himself. As long as you keep your head, you survive. But deep inside, he knew survival wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about staying relevant. And when Joey Merlino started making moves that caught the FBI's attention, Ralph realized something chilling. His protege might be the one to drag him into the storm he'd spent his life avoiding. That night, as the city lights flickered over the Delaware River, Ralph Natale stood by his window and whispered to himself, "The old world's gone. But maybe there's one last lesson left to teach." He didn't know it yet, but that final lesson about loyalty, survival, and betrayal would define the rest of his life. The city was alive again, but in all the wrong ways. Philadelphia in the early 90s was flashing lights, loud music, and chaos hiding behind expensive suits. The underworld wasn't the same quiet, disciplined system Ralph Natale once knew. It was a noisy, reckless playground where loyalty was temporary and headlines replaced handshakes. And right in the middle of that transformation stood Joey Merlino, the young lion Ralph had once tried to tame. Ralph watched from the shadows, half proud and half terrified. Joey had charisma, no doubt. He could walk into a room full of hardened men and have them laughing within minutes. He had that rare ability to make everyone feel like they mattered even when they didn't. But that same charm was a double-edged blade. It drew attention, the kind Ralph had spent a lifetime avoiding. By 1992, Joey had become the face of a new Philadelphia. Slick, fast, dangerous. He was taking control of corners, rebuilding crews, and pushing out the old-timers who refused to adapt. His name began to appear in whispers in newspapers, even in TV coverage. To most people, he was a handsome young businessman. To those who knew the streets, he was the next big boss. Ralph, meanwhile, was content to let the spotlight pass him by. He'd been in prison, paid his dues, and kept his mouth shut when others broke. Now, older and wiser, he knew how quickly fame turned into fire. Still, Joey wanted him by his side. One night, in the back booth of a crowded club pulsing with music, Joey leaned close. "Ralph," he said with that familiar smirk, "you're a legend. You built what we have, but it's time for something new. I need your mind and your name to make it happen." Ralph studied him carefully. "You sure you know what you're asking for? The moment you start building something this big, every eye, law enforcement, rivals, even your own friends, starts watching." Joey shrugged, the arrogance of youth radiating from him. "Let them watch. We'll give them a show they'll never forget." That was the beginning of their partnership, the mentor and the prodigy. Ralph saw it as a chance to guide the new generation, maybe even restore some structure to the chaos. Joey saw it as his ticket to greatness. Together they began piecing together a modern empire. Ralph handled the business side, union contacts, construction projects, legitimate investments. Joey handled the streets, collections, relationships, and maintaining a presence. It was a balance of brains and boldness. For a time, it worked beautifully. Ralph even started to feel alive again. The meetings, the deals, the subtle power that came from being respected, it reminded him of who he'd been. And with Joey beside him, he thought maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something that lasted. But there was always something lurking in the shadows. The FBI had shifted their focus back to Philadelphia. Surveillance vans rolled through South Philly like silent ghosts. Wiretaps spread through bars, homes, and offices. And the agents weren't just after names. They were after stories. They wanted to dismantle the myth of untouchable mobsters once and for all. Ralph could sense it. He'd seen this pattern too many times. "We're being watched," he warned Joey one afternoon in a quiet cafe. "Every word you say could be played back one day in a courtroom." Joey just smiled, sipping his espresso. "They've been watching us since I was a kid. If they had anything, we wouldn't be sitting here." That arrogance. Ralph saw it as both Joey's gift and curse. He had confidence that inspired men, but it blinded him to danger. Ralph had lived long enough to know that when the government wanted you, time was just a formality. By the mid-90s, the cracks began to show. Younger guys in Joey's circle started acting recklessly. Fights in clubs, disputes over money, careless phone calls. Ralph tried to keep order, but he could feel it slipping. The discipline of the old days was gone. One night, during a small gathering at a South Philly house, an argument broke out between two crew members over a missed payment. Voices rose, threats followed. Ralph stepped in, his tone steady but commanding. Enough. You think this is how we built things before? Men used to respect each other. You can't build an empire on noise and ego. The room fell quiet. Ralph's voice carried that weight only experience could give. But when he looked at Joey, he saw something unsettling. Disinterest. Joey wasn't the kid who listened anymore. He was the king surrounded by followers, and even Ralph's words barely reached him. Still, Ralph stayed. Loyalty wasn't a word he took lightly. He'd seen too many men turn their backs when things got hard. He wouldn't be one of them. But deep down, a question started to whisper at him. Was he loyal to the man, or to the idea of what the life used to mean? Then the walls began to close in. One morning, agents showed up at Ralph's house. It wasn't his first raid, but this one felt different. They were polite, even respectful as they led him outside. Cameras flashed, and for the first time in decades, Ralph felt exposed. The streets that once bowed to him now watched him with curiosity, maybe even pity. Inside the interrogation room, the questions were sharp. The agents knew names, dates, meetings. They had tapes. Hours of Joey talking, laughing, making promises. They didn't want Ralph's past. They wanted Joey's present. "Help us," one agent said quietly. "You've spent your whole life keeping order, and he's tearing it apart. This doesn't have to end with you taking the fall for his mistakes." Ralph didn't respond. He stared at the wall, thinking of everything he'd lived through. The codes, the sacrifices, the nights spent wondering if loyalty still meant anything. For days, the pressure built. Every visit, every question chipped away at him. And then came the realization that no one from Joey's side had come to check on him. No calls, no lawyers, no messages. Silence. He'd been forgotten by the very people he'd protected. Sitting alone in his cell that night, Ralph thought about all the men who had called themselves family. He thought about Bruno, about the code, about how the streets used to mean something. And he knew then that something fundamental had died. Not just in the world, but inside him. Maybe loyalty had an expiration date after all. The next morning, when the agents came back, Ralph didn't say much. He simply looked up and said, "If I talk, I tell it all. But you don't twist it. You don't turn it into a circus. You let the truth be what it is." It wasn't revenge that drove him. It was something colder, quieter. A final act of control in a world that had spun out of it. The moment Ralph Natale agreed to speak, history shifted. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become something no one ever expected. A man who broke the code to expose what the code had become. And that decision, whispered in that sterile room, would shake the entire Philadelphia underworld to its core. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the interrogation room seemed louder than ever. Ralph Natale sat still, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The agents across from him exchanged quick glances. They knew what was about to happen was historic, but Ralph didn't care about history. He wasn't doing this to make a name for himself or to erase his sins. He was doing it because, for the first time in his life, he'd realized loyalty was a one-way street. When you grow up in the life, you're taught the code before you even understand it. You keep your mouth shut. You protect your own. You die before you betray. But Ralph had watched that code rot from the inside. He'd seen men swear allegiance one day and sell out the next. He'd watched loyalty traded for profit, respect replaced with ego. So when the FBI offered him a deal, he didn't see it as betrayal. He saw it as survival, the last move of a dying strategist. The agent leaned forward. "You know what this means, right? Once you start, there's no going back." Ralph gave a small nod. "I've been living in the past too long," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time someone told the truth." Over the next few weeks, Ralph began to talk. At first, slowly, carefully. He named names, recounted meetings, explained the structure of the Philadelphia family. He didn't dramatize anything, didn't glorify it. He spoke like a man reading from a history book, steady, factual, detached. The agents recorded every word. To them, this was gold. To Ralph, it was closure. But every confession came with a sting. Each name he said felt like another cut across years of friendship and trust. He remembered sitting at tables with those men, breaking bread, celebrating births and weddings. He remembered their laughter, their promises. Now, those same names would echo in courtrooms attached to charges and sentences. At night, back in his holding cell, Ralph couldn't sleep. The walls seemed to whisper, voices from the past asking why. He didn't have an answer that would make sense to them. How do you explain to ghosts that the world they built no longer exists? That the family they died for turned into something unrecognizable? He thought about Joey Merlino most of all, the kid he'd mentored, the one he'd believed could restore honor to the life. He'd given Joey his trust, his wisdom, even his blessing. And Joey had left him to rot. No visit, no call, not even a whisper of concern. That betrayal stung more than any bullet ever could. But when word spread that Ralph Natale was cooperating, the underworld shook. Men who'd once bragged about their connections to him suddenly denied ever knowing him. The newspapers ran stories with headlines that made him sound like a villain who'd betrayed his brothers. But Ralph didn't care about the noise. He knew what was coming. The trials, the testimonies, the outrage. He'd become the first sitting mafia boss in American history to testify for the government, and he accepted that role like a man walking into a storm with his eyes open. When the trial began, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Reporters filled every seat, their pens ready. Across the room sat Joey Merlino, calm, composed, dressed like he owned the place. Ralph's eyes met his for a brief moment. There was no anger, no hatred, just silence, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they'd both fallen. When Ralph took the stand, he didn't falter. His voice was low, but clear. "This isn't about revenge," he said at one point. "It's about truth. We all made choices. Some of us kept our word and some of us didn't. I'm not here to paint myself as a saint. I'm here to tell you what happened." The courtroom hung on every word. Ralph spoke of meetings in restaurants, whispered conversations in parked cars, unspoken deals sealed with handshakes. He painted a portrait of a world few had ever seen up close, but without romanticizing it. There was no glamour in his tone, just the weary realism of a man who'd seen the cost of power up close. Outside, the media turned him into a symbol, the man who broke the code. Some called him a coward, others called him brave. Ralph didn't care for either title. He knew the truth was more complicated. In a life built on lies, maybe honesty was the only rebellion left. After the testimony, he was moved into witness protection. A new name, a new home, a new life. The government offered safety, but not peace. He lived quietly, far from the noise of the city, spending his days in near isolation. Sometimes he'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee and watch the world move on without him. He missed the rhythm of the old streets, the laughter, the music, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. But then he'd remember the betrayals, the paranoia, the endless cycle of fear and deceit. He realized the thing he missed wasn't the life itself. It was the illusion of belonging. Years passed. Ralph aged, his hair silver, his voice softer, his eyes tired but still sharp. Occasionally, a journalist or documentary producer would track him down, asking for interviews. Most of the time he said no. But once, in a rare moment of reflection, he agreed to speak. The interviewer asked him one question that lingered in the air. "Do you regret it? Talking, testifying, breaking the code?" Ralph looked out the window for a long time before answering. "You can't break something that's already shattered," he said finally. The code died long before I opened my mouth. I just told the world what was left. The silence that followed said more than any words could. He lived the rest of his days quietly, a ghost of an era that no longer existed. But even as time moved on, his story remained. A reminder that the line between loyalty and survival is thinner than anyone wants to admit. And somewhere deep inside, despite everything, Ralph Natale still believed in one thing, that no matter how dark the road becomes, every man deserves the chance to tell his story before it ends. By the time Ralph Natale entered his final decade, the world he'd once ruled had all but vanished. The streets that had echoed with whispers of power and fear now hummed with the noise of coffee shops, condos, and smartphone chatter. The old bars were gone, the social clubs boarded up or converted into boutiques. The names that once commanded respect, Scarfo, Bruno, Merlino, had faded into the fog of history, their legacies reduced to chapters in crime documentaries and podcasts. Ralph would sometimes take walks in the quiet neighborhoods where nobody knew who he was. He'd pass by young men laughing outside delis, their futures open and untouched by the ghosts of his generation. They reminded him of himself once, sharp suit, sharper dreams, thinking he could outsmart time. But he had learned the hard way. Time is the only boss that never loses. He lived under an assumed name now. The government had kept its promise, new identity, a modest house, a quiet pension to live on. To the neighbors, he was just an old Italian man who liked strong coffee and kept to himself. They didn't know that the man who smiled politely while collecting his mail had once sat at the top of Philadelphia's underworld. But solitude had a way of magnifying old thoughts. At night, when the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, memories came flooding back. He'd close his eyes and see faces, men long gone, their laughter echoing through smoke-filled rooms. Some of them he missed. Others, he wished he could forget. But they were all part of him, stitched into his story like scars you couldn't hide. Sometimes he'd wake from dreams that felt too real. He'd see himself in the old clubs, sitting in a booth with Angelo Bruno, the old docile Don, who had believed in peace more than blood. Ralph had admired that. Bruno had ruled quietly, through diplomacy, not violence. And maybe that's why he was killed, because the new world didn't understand peace anymore. It demanded chaos. Ralph had been young then, eager to prove himself, but now he saw Bruno's wisdom. In a life where everyone was obsessed with power, the true strength was in restraint. He'd sit on his porch at sunset, thinking about how differently things could have gone. What if he had walked away earlier? What if he'd chosen family over the family? But the what-ifs didn't change anything. They only deepened the ache of knowing how impossible redemption really was in his world. Once a local journalist tracked him down. She was young, ambitious, and polite, asking if he'd consider giving one last interview. "You've lived history," she said. "People want to understand what it was really like." Ralph gave a small smile. "They think they do," he replied, "but the truth isn't what they expect." After some hesitation, he agreed. The interview took place at his kitchen table, coffee steaming between them. She asked about power, betrayal, loyalty, all the words that sounded so big to people who never lived them. Ralph answered simply. "Power," he said, "isn't about who's feared. It's about who's remembered." She leaned forward. "And do you think you'll be remembered?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe for the wrong reasons." He paused, then added, "You spend your whole life chasing respect, but when you finally get it, you realize it's worth less than peace. And peace is the one thing this life never gives you." When the interview aired months later, it went viral. People were fascinated by the calmness in his voice, the lack of bitterness. Some called him wise, others called him manipulative. Ralph ignored it all. He knew people loved stories about gangsters because they made them feel like they understood danger from a safe distance. But the truth was much colder. It wasn't about glory, it was about survival. As the years went by, he began to write. Not a confession, not a defense, just reflections. Short notes scribbled in a notebook he kept by his bedside. He wrote about loyalty, about how it could both bind and destroy. He wrote about silence, and how it wasn't always noble. It could be cowardice disguised as honor. And he wrote about love, the one thing he'd always wanted but never truly mastered. Sometimes he thought of his wife, long gone now. The years of distance, the heartbreak, the way the life had swallowed every part of them. He regretted not leaving sooner, not giving her a normal life. But regret, he'd learned, doesn't fix anything. It just lingers like smoke after a fire. He began to see himself not as a villain or a hero, but as something in between. A man shaped by his choices and by the world that made those choices seem necessary. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he didn't pretend to be innocent either. I did what I had to do, he'd tell himself quietly, and I paid the price for it. The decline of the mafia fascinated him. The rules that once governed everything, omerta, respect, family, had eroded. The new generation didn't understand patience or discipline. They flaunted their crimes online, turning something once built on silence into a spectacle. Ralph saw it as the final nail in the coffin. "We used to live in the shadows," he said once, shaking his head. "Now they're begging for the spotlight. The life's finished." And maybe that was for the best. He'd come to believe that the fall of the old world was necessary. Too many lives had been wasted, too many families broken. If the younger generation could learn from their mistakes, even just one lesson, maybe all that blood and silence had meant something. As his health declined, Ralph found himself visiting the local church more often. He wasn't a religious man, not in the traditional sense, but the quiet gave him comfort. The smell of old wood, the faint echo of footsteps. It reminded him that even sinners deserved a place to sit and think. One afternoon, the priest approached him gently. "Do you ever feel peace, my son?" he asked. Ralph smiled faintly. "Not yet," he said, "but I'm closer than I've ever been." He knew his time was nearing its end. There were no grand goodbyes, no final deals. Just a man, once feared and respected, sitting in the soft light of evening, watching the world move on without him. In those final days, he realized something simple but profound, that his story wasn't about crime or betrayal. It was about choices. Every decision, every alliance, every moment of silence had shaped the person he became, and though he had made peace with his past, he hoped others might learn from it. Loyalty, he once wrote in his notebook, isn't about who you protect. It's about what you stand for when no one's watching. The morning sun slipped through the blinds of Ralph Natale's small kitchen, warming the faded checkered tablecloth as a kettle whistled softly on the stove. He moved slowly these days, his body stiff, his hands trembling slightly. But his mind was sharp, still replaying decades of memories like old reels of film. Every sound, every smell could bring back 1,000 ghosts. The scent of espresso reminded him of meetings that began with handshakes and ended in silence. The hum of distant traffic carried the rhythm of the streets he once ruled. He'd lived long enough to see his world disappear. The mob wasn't what it used to be. The power, the order, the respect, it had all crumbled. The men who once swore eternal loyalty had either died, disappeared, or like him, had chosen survival over silence. But survival came with its own kind of punishment. Each day, Ralph woke up in a world that barely remembered him, and yet, he couldn't forget any of it. That morning, he opened the worn notebook that had become his only companion. Its pages were filled with uneven handwriting, sketches of memories, and words that felt heavier than confession. He wrote not for fame or forgiveness, but for clarity. "History will tell its version," he murmured, pen scratching against paper. "But only I know what it truly cost." He wrote about loyalty, the sacred word that had once defined his entire existence. To Ralph, loyalty was never about obedience. It was about trust. and trust was the rarest currency in his world. He remembered the men he'd called brothers, men who had laughed with him in smoke-filled clubs and vanished when the tables turned. Betrayal, he realized, wasn't an act. It was a process. It started with small lies, unreturned calls, and finally, the silence that sealed your fate. But the betrayal that hurt most wasn't from friends. It was from time. Time had betrayed them all. The neighborhoods where power once pulsed now buzzed with tourists and tech startups. The corner bars were coffee shops. The families that once ruled the city were now stories whispered in documentaries. It wasn't just the end of an era. It was the erasure of it. Ralph took a deep breath and looked out the window. Across the street, two kids were playing basketball, laughing so hard one of them fell to the ground. He smiled faintly. That laughter, pure, unguarded, felt foreign to him. His own youth had been spent proving himself, never truly living. He'd learned too early that in his world, to be feared was safer than to be loved. But sitting there, with the hum of life outside his window, he wondered if that belief had cost him more than he ever realized. One evening, as he sat on the porch, a man approached him, a stranger in his 40s, polite but hesitant. "You're Ralph Natale, aren't you?" the man asked quietly. Ralph didn't answer right away. Over the years, he'd learned that recognition rarely brought good news. "Depends who's asking," he said finally, his tone measured. "My name's Tony. My grandfather used to know you. He worked in the neighborhood back in the day. He always said you were different." "Fair." Ralph studied him for a moment. The man's sincerity disarmed him. "Fair?" he repeated with a faint smile. "That's not a word people usually use for me." Tony shrugged. "He said you weren't cruel for the sake of it. Said you believed in rules, even when others didn't." Ralph leaned back, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. "Rules," he muttered. "We all had them once. Then greed came and the rules meant nothing. That's when everything fell apart." Tony hesitated before asking, "Do you ever regret it?" Ralph took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Regret's a tricky thing," he said softly. "You think about what could have been, sure. But when you've spent your life making choices in a world built on survival, regret doesn't change much. It's just a ghost you learn to live with." They talked for a while, about the old days, about how the city had changed, and about how men like Ralph had become legends that nobody wanted to claim. When Tony finally left, Ralph sat in silence, the streetlights flickering on as dusk settled. For the first time in years, he felt something strange, almost like peace. That night, he opened his notebook again. He wrote, "Maybe we were never meant to win. Maybe our job was to show the world what power without conscience becomes. And maybe the real victory is that nobody wants to live like that anymore." The next morning, he woke early, driven by a strange burst of energy. He decided to visit an old part of the city, South Philadelphia, where it had all begun. The cab ride was quiet, the city rolling past him like a dream he barely recognized. When he arrived, the streets were cleaner, the faces younger, but beneath it all, he could still feel the pulse of history. He walked past what used to be a club, now a trendy restaurant. Inside, the laughter was lighter, the air brighter. It was strange to think that deals once sealed with handshakes and unspoken threats had taken place in the same room where people now toasted with wine and snapped selfies. He smiled to himself. Time had a sense of irony. As he stood there, a memory washed over him. His first night as an official, made man. The pride, the fear, the feeling that he'd finally become someone. But now, standing on the same corner decades later, he realized that the title had meant nothing without peace of mind. Power had been a loan, not a gift, and the interest had been paid in years he could never get back. That evening, back home, he sat with the notebook again. His handwriting was slower now, but his words carried a lifetime's worth of clarity. He wrote, "We thought we were untouchable, but the truth is, Nobody escapes the past, not even me. The streets forget your name, but your conscience never does. He closed the notebook and stared at it for a long while. For the first time, he wasn't writing to justify or explain. He was writing to let go. The ghosts would always be there, but he didn't have to carry them anymore. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Ralph leaned back and closed his eyes. The house was quiet, the world outside calm. For once, there was no fear of tomorrow, no echo of the past clawing at him, just stillness. And in that stillness, he realized something profound. Maybe redemption didn't come from others forgiving you. It came from you finally forgiving yourself. The night air carried a quiet chill as Ralph Natale walked slowly down a narrow South Philadelphia street, his cane tapping softly against the sidewalk. The neighborhood had changed. Slick apartments, fancy cafes, young couples walking dogs. But to him, every brick still whispered stories. Stories of power, loyalty, betrayal, and the strange kind of brotherhood that had ruled these blocks long before the new lights replaced the old shadows. He stopped in front of an old building. Its sign now read Urban Brew Cafe. But once, decades ago, that very spot had been a bar where business was discussed in whispers and deals were sealed with nods instead of signatures. The smell of espresso drifted through the door, mingling with faint jazz music. Ralph smiled faintly. In another life, he might have liked it here. He took a seat by the window, ordered a coffee, and watched the world move. No one recognized him. To them, he was just another old man nursing memories. But to those who once knew his name, Ralph Natale had been a man you didn't cross. He had commanded respect not through cruelty, but through presence, the kind of quiet power that made people listen. And yet, now, sitting in that cafe, he realized how little of that power remained. It had evaporated like steam from the cup before him. "Excuse me," a voice said softly. Ralph looked up. A woman, maybe in her late 40s, stood hesitantly beside his table. She wore a brown coat, her expression both curious and respectful. "You're Ralph Natale, right?" He nodded slowly. "Used to be," he said with a tired grin. "My father knew you," she said. "He used to talk about the old days. Said you were a man who always kept your word." Ralph's eyes softened. "What was your father's name?" "Tommy Mancini," she replied. "He passed a few years ago." Ralph leaned back, memories stirring like dust in sunlight. "Tommy. Yeah, I remember. Good man. Tough, but decent. Always looked out for his own." The woman smiled faintly. "He said you were one of the last men who believed in the code. Said that even when everything went bad, you didn't break your word." He looked down at his coffee, the reflection of the lights trembling on the surface. "I broke plenty of things," he said quietly, "but maybe not my word." They talked for a while. She told him about her father's final years, how he'd often sit on the porch and tell stories about a time when respect meant something, even among thieves. Ralph listened in silence, the warmth of nostalgia mingling with regret. When she finally left, she thanked him simply, "For treating my father like family when nobody else would." As she walked away, Ralph sat there lost in thought. It wasn't power or fear that people remembered. It was decency. The smallest acts of loyalty, the quiet gestures that cost nothing but meant everything. That realization hit him harder than any confession he'd ever made. Later that night, Ralph sat alone in his apartment. The city lights flickered against the window pane, reflecting across the pages of his notebook. He turned to a blank page and began to write. "We spent our lives chasing respect, but the real respect comes when no one's watching. When you do right because you can, not because you have to. Maybe that's what I missed all those years. Maybe that's what it means to be free." His hand trembled slightly as he wrote. The pen paused. Then, with a sigh, he set it down. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. The next morning, he received an unexpected visitor. It was an old face, Joey Merlino's cousin, Frankie. He looked older now, heavier around the eyes, but there was still a spark of that street confidence in his step. "Ralph," Frankie said with a grin, "you're a hard man to find." "I wasn't hiding," Ralph replied, "just finally sitting still." Frankie chuckled. "That's a first. You used to never stop moving, always 10 steps ahead of everyone." Ralph gestured to the chair across from him. "Time catches us all." They talked for hours about the old days, the chaos, the betrayals, the way the Philadelphia family had burned itself from the inside out after Ralph's fall. Frankie spoke openly, the way only old men could when they realized there was nothing left to hide. "You know," Frankie said at one point, leaning forward, "people still talk about you. They say you were the last one who tried to keep things right, before everything went wild." Ralph smirked. "Right?" he said softly. "There was no right. Just less wrong." Frankie laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe. But you made people think twice before they crossed a line. Nobody does that anymore. Now it's all noise and chaos. No order." Ralph looked out the window, his gaze distant. Order only works when people believe in something bigger than themselves. Once greed takes over, the rules mean nothing. That's when the fall starts. Frankie nodded, quiet for a moment. "You ever think about how it all ended?" "Every day," Ralph said. "And you know what I realized? It didn't end, it just changed shape. The streets still have power games, just different players. But the story's always the same. Ambition, loyalty, betrayal. It's the oldest script in the world." They sat in silence for a while. Then Frankie stood to leave. "You should come by the club sometime," he said. "We've got guys who'd love to hear your stories." Ralph smiled faintly. "Maybe one day. But right now, I'm good, just remembering them quietly." As the door closed behind Frankie, Ralph felt something like closure settle in. The past wasn't gone. It was just finally quiet. That night, he went for a slow walk through the neighborhood. The sounds of laughter, music, and life filled the air. He passed by an alley where decades ago he'd once made a choice that changed everything. Now it was just another empty stretch of pavement. He stood there for a long time, feeling the ghosts of what had been. Under the glow of the streetlights, Ralph whispered, "I did what I thought I had to. Maybe that's all any of us can say." Then he smiled, softly, almost peacefully, and kept walking, fading into the hum of the city he had once ruled. The night had grown quiet in Philadelphia, the kind of quiet that seemed to hum with memory. Ralph Natale sat near the window of his dimly lit apartment, the city lights flickering like distant stars across the glass. The notebook sat open before him, a pen resting on the edge. He wasn't writing tonight, not yet. He was remembering. There was a rhythm to the past, he thought. It came back not all at once, but in fragments, faces, voices, places, pieces of a life that had once burned too brightly. Some nights, those memories felt like ghosts haunting him. Other nights, they felt like old friends sitting down for one last drink. He took a slow breath and reached for the radio, tuning it to an old jazz station. The soft melody filled the silence, wrapping around him like a familiar scent. It reminded him of the clubs where it had all begun. The laughter, the smoke curling through the air, the sound of deals whispered over music. He could still see it. The sharp suits, the easy smiles, the sense of control that had made him feel invincible. But that was the illusion, wasn't it? Control. The truth, he realized, was that nobody ever really had control. Not over loyalty, not over fate, and certainly not over time. Time had taken everything. The faces he'd trusted most were gone. Some had fallen in the streets. Others had disappeared into prison cells or the shadows of the witness stand. He reached for the coffee cup beside him, though the drink had gone cold hours ago. "We all thought we'd live forever," he murmured to the empty room. "Turns out forever was shorter than we thought." A knock came at the door, startling him slightly. It was late, too late for casual visits. Slowly, he rose and opened it. Standing there was a man he hadn't seen in decades. Older now, grayer, but unmistakable. "Paulie," Ralph said, his voice a mix of surprise and warmth. "Well, I'll be damned." Paulie smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd still recognize me." "I'd know that face anywhere," Ralph said, stepping aside to let him in. They sat across from each other, two men shaped by the same world, but changed by different roads. Paulie had been one of Ralph's closest friends back in the day, loyal, sharp, and smart enough to survive. When everything fell apart, he'd disappeared quietly, and Ralph had assumed he was gone for good. "I heard you were still around," Paulie said, looking around the small apartment. "Living quiet." Ralph chuckled. "Quiet's underrated. You learn to appreciate it when you've spent half your life surrounded by noise." Paulie nodded, studying him carefully. "You look good, considering everything." Ralph smirked. "That's one way to say I look old." They laughed, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy, but from shared survival. After a moment, Paulie grew serious. "I've been thinking a lot about those days," he said softly. "About how it all went wrong." Ralph leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It didn't go wrong, Paulie. It went exactly how it was supposed to. You play that game long enough, there's only ever one ending. The streets don't love anybody." Paulie nodded slowly. "Maybe, but I still wonder, was it worth it?" That question lingered in the air. Ralph didn't answer right away. He'd asked himself the same thing countless times, but the answer always slipped through his fingers. Finally, he said, "It was worth what I learned, not what I earned." Paulie raised an eyebrow. "And what did you learn?" Ralph looked out the window again. The city glowed beneath them, restless and alive. That respect built on fear doesn't last. That loyalty can't be bought. And that peace only comes when you stop chasing ghosts. Paulie nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You always were the philosopher, even back then." Ralph smiled faintly. "I had to be. Somebody had to think while the rest of you were breaking things." They talked deep into the night, about old faces, forgotten deals, and the strange quiet that came after the chaos. When Paulie finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "You know, Ralph," he said, "a lot of people talk bad about you. But me, I think you did what you thought was right. That's more than most can say." Ralph looked up at him. "I appreciate that, Paulie. But right and wrong stopped mattering a long time ago. These days, I just hope to sleep without seeing their faces." Paulie gave a small nod, then slipped into the hallway, leaving Ralph alone again with the hum of the city. He sat for a long time after that, staring at the notebook. Eventually, he began to write. The words came slowly, but with weight. "We wanted to be kings, but kings die the same as everyone else.